Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 575 for the first of Tammuz in a regular year. Once again, happy Rosh Chodesh for day 2 of 2-day Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. So we all grew up, or most of us anyways, grew up with fairy tales, right? In some form or another, like maybe Aesop's Fables, Hans Christian Andersen, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, things like that. Disney movies, all of these kind of things. And at the time when you first read these stories or had these stories read to you, or you watched them on TV or in the movie theater, then you probably just really got lost in the story itself, and you probably just really enjoyed the fantastical element of it all. And maybe when you got a little bit older, you started to think about these stories in a deeper way, and you started to realize that these weren't just stories for the sake of stories, but they were actually there to teach you a lesson. That many of these stories were allegorical in nature. So allegories are a very powerful tool to teach lessons, both to children and to adults, about different things. The Tanya is filled with allegories. Chassidus in general, Torah in general, is filled with allegories. Allegories are really an essential component to most teaching methodologies. However, where teaching might fall short, where the education might fall short, is if the student never realizes that what it is that they're learning is actually just an allegory and is not meant to be taken literally. An example of this that comes to mind is from a book, which is one of the most famous allegories, namely the book Animal Farm by George Orwell. So for those of you who are not so familiar with it, so Animal Farm is a very short book that was written kind of almost like in a children's book format, all about these animals that live on a farm. And after living on this farm for some time, some of the animals decide to rebel against their human master and create a society of equality for all the animals. And then this leads to, eventually it spirals into a dictatorship of where some of the animals gain control over the other animals and rule over them. And when George Orwell wrote this, he wrote it as an allegory for the Russian Revolution and for the danger of communism, at least in the way that it was coming about in Russia. So what's interesting about this is I actually have a good friend who, when she first read Animal Farm as a kid, she had no idea that it was an allegory. She just thought that it was a story about animals, and that it was just like a very interesting story about animals on a farm, which is cute, and it is a good story about animals on a farm. And you could read the story in that way. Like a lot of the fairy tales, the Aesop's Fables, these kind of things, they can be read just in their story format, and you could never even get into the allegory aspect of them. But you really are actually missing the whole point if you don't realize at some point that it's an allegory. So why am I bringing all of this up? Well, this is because that is exactly the subject of today's Tanya, and this is what the Alter Rebbe is going to do. He's kind of giving us a little bit of a time out, so to speak, to remind us of the allegorical nature of a lot of what it is that we're talking about, and specifically the allegorical nature of the idea of the sun and sunlight. So if you've been following along and if you've been paying attention for the past little while, then you notice that one recurring theme that keeps coming up is where we liken God and the way that God relates to the world and to the sun and sunlight, and this is often given as a really profound analogy for helping us understand how God relates to the world by looking at the sun, and how it is that there's nothing in the world except for God, and that nothing has its own existence. And we related this to sunlight, and how sunlight has no existence of its own other than the sun, and that if you were to shine rays of sunlight back into the sun itself, then they would cease to exist. So this is a really useful way to understand God, and at least insofar as our relationship with him. But what the Alter Rebbe is going to do today is he's going to just give us a little reminder and remind us that ultimately this is just an analogy, and we should not equate God with the sun, God forbid, or even God's radiance and the way he relates to us to light. So yes, we call it God's light. We say Or Ein Sof, the light of the infinite light, and that's how we reference God. But we need to remember that this is just an allegory, that God is not actually light. God is not the sun. He's not the source of light. He's way beyond these kind of things. And that just like if you want to teach a child or even an adult about the Russian Revolution, sometimes rather than getting into the technicalities of the war and all that stuff, then it's a lot easier to present it in an allegorical format, and which is a lot more graspable. That's basically why it is that we use this analogy of the sun. So that's going to be the focus of today's episode. So let's get into the text. And for context, we are beginning chapter 10 of Sha'ar HaYichud. And so here we go. And so basically, the Alter Rebbe is leaving off from last time. So last time we talked about this idea of the essentially unknowable nature of God, and specifically God's unity, God's oneness. So, and how when it is that we say that God and his attributes are not just composites, but in fact they are unified in a true unified sense, even though God is not limited by his attributes, and he's not just like a composite of his attributes. So all of this pointed to this kind of like inability of the human mind to be able to grasp this idea, to grasp this essential paradoxical nature of how on the one hand God's attributes are not really him. Like even if you were to take like all of these attributes and put them together, you wouldn't then you would have God, because God's not a composite of his attributes. Nevertheless, each one of God's attributes are essentially unified with him. And so this is something that it's just perplexing to the human mind. It's something that we just need to accept on faith and accept the fact that we will never know this. So that's where we left off yesterday. And so today the Alter Rebbe takes us from here, and he says, okay, even though that, yes, it's essentially unknowable, this aspect of the unity of God with his attributes, nevertheless, the Torah spoke to us in human terms, in human language. L'shakech et ha'ozen, it's called in Hebrew. So to modulate for the ear what it is able to hear. So again, it's like, if we want to talk about the Russian Revolution, a way to make that like more accessible to children is and to adults also, is to talk about it in terms of animals on a farm, right? So this is why, since God wanted us to be able to have a sense of him. He didn't want to remain just like this abstract thing that we'll never be able to grasp on any level at all. He wanted us to have like some type of sense of him. So this is why it was given permission to the Kabbalists to speak about the spheros by way of analogy, and to speak of them in terms of being lights, orot in Hebrew. So the spheros are not actually literally lights, but we talk of them as if they're lights. We allegorically refer to them as if they are lights, because through this allegory of referencing them as lights, we can understand a little bit this idea of the unity of God with his midos, with his attributes, which is by way of an analogy, like when we talk about the unity of the light of the sun within the body of the sun itself, which is called the luminary, which is called the ma'or. So the sun is called the ma'or, the luminary, and then it's like you have the light, the or, which is when it shines within the body of the sun itself, then it disappears, right? Which we spoke about before. And then the Alter Rebbe here says that we see a reference to this idea of the sun being called the luminary, like the source of the light, or in Hebrew, the ma'or, in Bereshis chapter 1, verse 16, where it says, Et ha'ma'or ha'gadol v'gomer, which means the greater luminary, like like the Torah is referencing how God created the world, and he's referencing the sun and the moon, and he refers to the moon the greater luminary, so it's the greater source of the light. So that's how we see that the sun is the source of the light. And then we see that, so we have the ma'or, the source of the light, and then the ray and the radiance and the spark that comes out from this source of light is called or, is called light. And we see this again in Bereshis. Interestingly, a little bit before it talks about the sun, where it's in Bereshis chapter 1, verse 5, where it says, V'ikra Elokim la'or yom. So God called the light day. So we see that God created light, which is separate than the luminary, because the light, as it is in the body of the sun, is totally united with utmost unity with the body of the sun. Because within the body of the sun, there is nothing but the luminary. There is nothing like you're going back to the source, right? So the ray and the light that's found inside of the body of the sun is like actually absolutely one with in an essential way with the body of the luminary that shines, and it doesn't have any existence of its own at all. And so this is exactly like this, and even more so, says the Alter Rebbe, how it is with God's attributes, as well as with God's will, and as well as it is with God's wisdom in the world of Atzilus, with God's essence, so to speak. So it's like when you go to that world of Atzilus, which is the highest of all the four worlds, that's the world where everything is just emanating out from its source. So it's like there, all of God's attributes are really nullified within him. They're one with his essential being, and God vests himself within them and unites within them with utmost unity because they came from him, just like we talk about the light coming from the sun. And so then the Alter Rebbe concludes, but it's not exactly this way. So it's like we're talking about it in this way of analogy. Like we're able to visualize the sun and the sunlight. And imagine if you had that sunlight and you were to shine it back into the ray of the sun. And the Alter Rebbe is teaching us that this is just like how it is with God. And then you have God, and then you have his attributes which come out from him. And then if you like shine those attributes back into him, like you have in Atzilus, then they become totally unified with him. So the Alter Rebbe is just reminding us in this last point that this is only an analogy, and it's actually very, very far from this idea, and it's something very far from our very wondrous and far and remote from our comprehension, because God's ways are much higher than our ways. So, and that's a citation from Yeshayahu chapter 55 verse 9, where in Hebrew it says, Ki gaphu drachav midrachenu. Okay, now that we've established that basis, now that we've established that preliminary disclaimer that like we get it, God is not the sun, God is not actually like the sun and all of that, we're going to explain why it is that we do use the analogy of the sun. And what the Alter Rebbe will basically explain is that while it's true that this analogy of the sun is very imperfect and very different than who God really is, it's useful for us. It's for the sake of the perceivers. It's for the sake of the audience, so to speak, that we use this. So the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that nevertheless, we use this analogy of the sun to l'shakech ha'ozen, it's called, to modulate for the ear what it is able to hear. So that is a citation from Rashi, from Shmot, from his commentary on Shmot chapter 19 verse 18, if anybody wants to look that up. So this idea basically of like that sometimes things are written in such a way for our sake, in order to make it more palatable to the human ear. And so from this analogy of sunlight, we can have an understanding of the attributes of God. So how? So it's like when we look at sunlight and we see how sunlight, as we've spoken about, is really unified and nullified in its source. And in its source, then we can't even call it sunlight. It's not like there's sunlight inside the sun. We just call it the sun. It would be redundant to say the sun contains sunlight. It's like, no, it's just the sun. So this is the same thing when we talk about the attributes of God, and as well as his will and wisdom. So just to clarify that, with the attributes of God, it's like in Hebrew the midos. We're basically usually talking about God's emotive attributes, chesed, gvura, tiferet, netzach, hod, yesod, and malchus. So too, just like how it is that sunlight, when it's in the sun itself, it loses its identity, its individuality. So too do God's attributes, as well as God's will and wisdom, are not called by any kind of names in relation to him. The only time we ever call these things by different kinds of names is in relation to created beings, whether we're talking about higher beings or lower beings, whose entire existence, vitality, and behavior is all brought about by God, who's giving them existence and vitality and is conducting them. So it's like God is really behind the scenes of the entirety of creation, whether we're talking about higher worlds or lower worlds and all of these things. It's all coming about through God, through God's will and wisdom and bina and das, which become enclosed in God's midos, God's holy midos. So just to break that down, so basically, God, through his will and through his intellectual attributes, these then get enclosed in God's midos, God's emotive attributes, and these bring the world into being. And then the Alter Rebbe backs up this statement by bringing something, by bringing a citation from the Midrash, which says, that the Midrash says that the world was brought about into being was created through these 10 things. Chochmah, Tvuna, Da. So this is an allusion to the 10 spheres through which God brings the world into being. And then also it says in Mishlei, in chapter 3, verse 19 to verse 20, where it says, Hashem b'chochmah yesad aretz, which literally means God founded the earth with wisdom. He established the heavens with understanding. With his knowledge, the depths of the abyss were burst open. So again, it's an allusion to this idea of how it is that God uses these spheros, these attributes, in order to create the world. He uses them like tools. Kind of like if you think about stained glass window, then the pictures on the stained glass window are tools to have the beautiful light shine through. So that's really what they're there for. And then also the Alter Rebbe here now cites Patach Eliyahu, who says, I'm not going to read the Aramaic, I'll just translate it. And this is, for context, this is part of, the Patach Eliyahu is part of the introduction to the Tikkunei Zohar. And so Patach Eliyahu writes, you have brought forth 10 tikkunim, and we call them 10 spheros. So tikkunim is like another word for garments, kind of, and we call them 10 spheros. So again, it's an allusion to the fact that these 10 spheros serve as garments through which the world will be created. And then it continues and it says, through which to direct hidden worlds unrevealed and worlds revealed. And through them, you conceal yourself. So that's the end of the section. So just to sum it up is, so basically it's like just this idea that when we talk about God's spheros and we were relating them, like what we've been doing so far is we've been saying spheros are to God like sunlight is to sun, right? Like if we had one of those like ratio, like comparison kind of exercises, that's what we would say. But then yesterday we were saying like, we should not get stuck on this because God is really not anything like the sun. And it's not, this is a very, very, very imperfect analogy. But then today we're bringing it back and we're bringing the analogy back and we're saying that yes, while it's true that it's an imperfect analogy and we should not, God forbid, think that God is actually like the sun and that God's spheres are actually like sunlight. Nevertheless, this analogy is very useful to us, and it was purposefully useful to us because this is how we perceive things. This is our perspective. And so keeping in mind that this is our perspective, we can understand how this is a very useful perspective because this perspective is what allows us to experience creation, to not lose our sense of self, and for there to be created beings and for the entire world and all of the worlds to exist. Just like, again, I'm going to go back to my analogy in the introduction, the stained glass window, on the one hand, there needs to be an awareness that like that stained glass window is not the actual source of the light, that it's like there, that would be silly to think that the light is essentially colorful. But nevertheless, we do perceive different colors in that light due to the stained glass window. And that's our perspective. Our perspective is these various colors and shapes and designs in the light. So that's it for today. And tomorrow we will continue and we'll conclude chapter 10, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.